Section 15 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 14. The last line of the stanza, explained. My house being now at rest. When the house of sensuality was at rest, that is, when the passions were mortified, concupiscence quenched, the desires subdued and lulled to sleep in the blessed night of sensitive purgation, the soul began to set out on the way of the Spirit, the way of proficients, which is also called the illuminative way, or the way of infused contemplation, wherein God himself nourishes and refreshes the soul without the help of any active efforts that itself may make. Such, as I have said, is this night and purgation of the senses. But this night, in their case, who are to enter into that more awful night of the Spirit, that they may go forwards to the divine union of the love of God, it is not everyone, but only a few who do so in general, is attended with heavy trials and temptations of sense of long continuance, but in some longer than in others. For to some is sent the angel of Satan, the spirit of impurity, to buffet them with horrible and violent temptations of the flesh, to afflict their minds with filthy thoughts, and their imaginations with representations of sin most vividly depicted, which at times becomes an affliction more grievous than death. This night is also occasionally attended by the spirit of blasphemy. The thoughts and conceptions are overrun with intolerable blasphemies, and, at times, suggested to the imagination with such violence as almost to break forth in words. This, too, is a heavy affliction. Again, another spirit, called by the prophet the spirit of giddiness, is sent to torment them. This spirit so obscures their judgment that they are filled with 1,000 scruples and perplexities. They can never satisfy themselves about them, nor submit their judgment therein to the counsel and direction of others. This is one of the most grievous stings and horrors of this night, most like to that which passes in the night of the Spirit. God ordinarily sends these violent storms and temptations in the night of sensitive purgation upon those whom he is about to lead afterwards into the other night, though all do not enter in, that being thus chastened and buffeted, they may prove themselves, dispose and habituate sense and faculties for the union of the divine wisdom to which they are to be then admitted. For if the soul be not tempted, exercised, and tried in temptations and afflictions, the senses thereof will never attain to wisdom. What doth he know, asks the wise man, that hath not been tried? He that hath no experience knoweth little. He that hath not been tried, what manner of things doth he know? Jeremiah also bears witness to the same truth, saying, Thou hast chastised me, and I was instructed. The most proper form of this chastening, for him who will apply himself unto wisdom, are those inferior trials of which I am now speaking. They are the most effectual for purging the sensitive nature from all sweetness and consolations, to which, by reason of our natural infirmities, we are addicted, and most capable of really humbling the soul, that it may be prepared for its coming exaltation. But how long the soul will continue in this fast and penance of sense, no one can with certainty tell. It is not the same in all men, neither are all men subjected to the same temptations. These trials are measured by the divine will, and are proportioned to the imperfections, many or few, which are to be purged away, and also to the degree of union in love to which God intends to elevate a particular soul. That is the measure of its humiliations, both in their intensity and duration. Those who are endowed with the capacity for suffering, and those who have force sufficient to endure, are purified in more intense trials and in less time. But those who are weak are purified very slowly, with weak temptations, and the night of their purgation is long. Their senses are refreshed from time to time, lest they should fall away. These, however, come late to the pureness of their perfection in this life, and some of them never. These persons are not clearly in the purgative night, nor clearly out of it. For though they make no onward progress, yet in order that they may be humble and know themselves, God tries them for a season in aridities and temptations, and visits them with his consolations at intervals, lest they should become faint-hearted, and seek for comfort in the ways of the world. From other souls, still weaker, God, as it were, hides himself, that he may try them in his love. For without this hiding of his face from them, they would never learn how to approach him. But those souls that are to go forwards to so blessed and exalted a state as this in the union of love, however quickly God may lead them, tarry long in general, amidst aridities, as we shall see by experience. Having now brought the first book to a close, I proceed to treat of the second night. End of section 15. Section 16 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2 of the Night of the Spirit. Chapter 1. The second night, that of the Spirit, when it begins. The soul, which God is leading onwards, enters not into the union of love at once, when it has passed through the aridities and trials of the first purgation and the night of sense. It must spend some time, perhaps years, after quitting the state of beginners, in exercising itself in the state of proficients. In this state, like a man released from a rigorous imprisonment, it occupies itself in divine things with much greater freedom and satisfaction, and its joy is more abundant and interior than it ever experienced in the beginning, before it entered the sensitive night. Its imagination and faculties being no longer tied down, as hitherto, to spiritual thoughts and reflections, it now rises at once to most tranquil and loving contemplation, and finds spiritual sweetness without the fatigue of meditation. But as the purgation of the soul is still somewhat incomplete, the chief part, the purgation of the spirit, being wanting, without which, by reason of the mutual connection between our higher and lower nature, man being an individual, the purgation of sense, however violent it may have been, is not finished and perfect. It will never be without some aridities, darkness, and trials, sometimes much more severe than in the past, which are, as it were, signs and heralds of the coming night of spirit, though not so lasting as that night. For when the days or the season of this tempestuous night have passed, the soul recovers at once its wonted serenity. It is in this way that God purifies some souls whom he does not raise to so high a degree of love as others. He admits them at intervals into the night of contemplation or spiritual purgation, causing the sun to shine upon them occasionally, and then to hide its face, according to the words of the psalmist. He sendeth his crystal, that is, contemplation, like morsels. These morsels of obscure contemplation are, however, never so intense as is that awful night of contemplation of which I am speaking, and into which God purposely leads the soul, that he may elevate it to the divine union. That sweetness and interior delight, which the proficients find so easily and so plentifully, come now in greater abundance than before, overflowing into the senses more than they were wont to do previous to the sensitive purgation. And as the senses are now more pure, they can taste of the sweetness of the Spirit in their way with greater facility. But since the sensitive part of the soul is weak, without any capacity for the strong things of the Spirit, they who are in the state of proficients are liable, by reason of the spiritual communications which reach to the sensitive part, to great infirmities and sufferings, and physical derangements, and consequently weariness of mind, as it is written, "The corruptible body presseth down the mind." Hence the communications made to these cannot be very strong, intense, or spiritual, such as they are required to be for the divine union with God, because of the weakness and corruption of the sensitive part, which has a share in them. Here are the source of ecstasies, raptures, and dislocation of the bones, which always happen whenever these communications are not purely spiritual. that is, granted to the mind alone, as in the case of the perfect, already purified in the second night of the Spirit. In them these raptures and physical sufferings have no place, for they enjoy liberty of spirit with unclouded and unsuspended senses. To make it clear how necessary it is for proficients to enter into the night of the Spirit, I will now proceed to point out certain imperfections and dangers to which they are liable. End of section 16. Section 17 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 2, of Certain Imperfections of Proficients. Proficients labor under two kinds of imperfections, one habitual, the other actual. The habitual imperfections are their affections and imperfect habits which still remain, like roots in the mind, where the purgation of sense could not penetrate. The difference between the purgation of them and the others is like the difference between plucking out a root and tearing off a branch, or like removing a fresh and an old stain. For, as I have said, the purgation of sense is merely the gate and entrance of contemplation, and serves rather to harmonize sense and spirit than to unite the latter with God. The stains of the old man still remain in the mind, though not visible, and if they be not removed by the strong soap and lye of the purgation of this night, the mind cannot attain to the pureness of the divine union. They suffer also from a certain dullness of mind, and a natural rudeness which every man contracts by sin. A distraction and dissipation of mind, which must be refined, enlightened, and made recollected in the sufferings and hardships of this night. All those who have not advanced beyond the state of proficients are subject to these habitual imperfections, which cannot coexist with the perfect state of union with God in love. But all are not subject to actual imperfections in the same way. Some, whose spiritual goods are so much on the surface, and so much under the influence of sense, fall into certain improprieties and dangers, of which I spoke in the beginning. For as they admit into their minds and senses so many communications, so that they have frequent imaginary and spiritual visions, for this happens together with other spiritual impressions to many of them in this state, wherein the devil and their own proper fancy delude the soul, and as Satan is wont with so much sweetness to insinuate and impress such things upon them, they are easily deluded and influenced by him, because they do not take the precaution to resign themselves into the hands of God, and defend themselves with all their might against these visions and impressions. For now the devil causes them both to believe in vain visions and false prophecies, and to presume that God and his saints are speaking to them. They also frequently believe in their own fancies. Now, too, Satan fills them with pride and presumption. Under the influence of vanity and arrogance, they make a show of themselves in the performance of exterior acts which have an appearance of sanctity, such as ecstasies and other phenomena. They become bold with God, losing holy fear, which is the key and guard of all virtue. Many of them become so entangled in manifold delusions, and so inveterate have their falsehoods grown, that their restoration to the pure road of virtue and real spirituality is exceedingly doubtful. They fall into this miserable condition because, too confident in themselves, they gave way to these spiritual apprehensions and impressions when they began to advance on the road of spirituality. I have much to say of these imperfections, and how much more incurable they are than the others, because they are considered as more spiritual than those which preceded them. But I shall pass on. One thing, however, I must say, to show how necessary for the further advancement of the soul the spiritual night is, that there is no one proficient, however great may be his exertions, who can be free from many of these natural affections and imperfect habits, the purification of which must, as I have said, necessarily precede the divine union. Besides, and I have said it before, inasmuch as the spiritual communications reach also to a lower part of the soul, they cannot be as intense, pure and strong, as it is necessary they should be for the purpose of the divine union. And, therefore, if that is to be attained, the soul must enter the second night of the spirit where, perfectly detaching sense and spirit from all sweetness and from all these apprehensions, these communications will guide it on the road of obscure and pure faith, the proper and adequate means of union, as it is written, I will espouse thee to me in faith, that is, I will unite myself to thee in faith. End of section 17. Section 18 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 3, Introduction. Proficients, then, have had experience of these sweet communications, in order that the sensitive part of the soul, allured and attracted by the spiritual sweetness overflowing into the senses, may be harmonized and united with the spiritual part. Both parts having to eat of the same spiritual food, each in its own way, off the same dish of their one individuality, that they might be prepared, united, and conformed for the sufferings of the sharp and rough purgation of the spirit which is before them. In that purgation, two parts of the soul, the spiritual and the sensitive, are to be wholly purified, for neither of them can be perfectly purified without the other, and the purgation of sense is then effectual when that of the spirit commences in earnest. Hence it follows that the night of sense may and should be called a certain reformation and bridling of the appetite rather than purgation, because all the imperfections and disorders of the sensitive part, having their strength and roots in the mind, can never be wholly purged away until the evil habits, rebelliousness, and perverseness of the mind are corrected. Therefore, in this night ensuing, both the parts of the soul are purified together. This is the end for which it was necessary to have passed through the reformation of the first night, and to have attained to that tranquillity which is its fruit, in order that, united together in spirit, they may both be purified and suffer together with the greater courage, most necessary for so violent and sharp a purgation. For if the weakness of the inferior part be not redressed, and if it have acquired no courage in God, in the sweet communions with Him subsequently enjoyed, nature would have given way, unprepared for the trials of this night. The intercourse of proficients with God is still most mean, because the gold of the Spirit is not purified or refined. They think and speak of Him as children, and their feelings are those of children, as described by the Apostle. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. Because they have not yet reached perfection, which is union with God in love. But in the state of perfection, having grown to manhood, they do great things in spirit, all their actions and all their faculties being now rather divine than human, as I shall hereafter explain. For God is stripping them of the old man, and putting on the new, as it is written, Put on the new man, who is created according to God. And again, Be reformed in the newness of your mind. He now denudes the faculties, the affections and feelings, spiritual and sensitive, interior and exterior, leaving the intellect obscure, the will dry, the memory empty, the affections of the soul in profoundest affliction, bitterness, and distress, withholding from the soul the former sweetness it had in spiritual things, that this privation may be one of the principles of which the mind has need, in order that the spiritual form of the Spirit, which is the union of love, may enter into it and be one with it. All this our Lord effects in the soul by means of this pure and obscure contemplation, as it is described in the first stanza. True, I have explained that in the beginning of my work, on the night of sense, yet its chief signification belongs to this second night of the Spirit, because that is the chief part of the purification of the soul. I shall, therefore, apply it in this sense, and explain it here again. End of section 18. Section 19 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 4. The first stanza, spiritually explained. In an obscure night, with anxious love inflamed, O happy lot, forth unobserved I went, my house being now at rest. Taking these words, then, with reference to purgation, contemplation, or detachment, or poverty of spirit, these are, as it were, one and the same thing. They may be thus explained. In poverty, unsupported by any apprehensions, in the obscurity of the intellect, in the conflict of the will, in the affliction and distress of memory, lost in the obscurity in pure faith, which is the obscure night of all the natural faculties, the will alone touched by grief and affliction, by the anxieties of my love of God, I went forth out of myself. I went forth out of myself, out of my low conceptions and lukewarm love, out of my scanty and poor sense of God, without being hindered by the flesh or the devil. This was to me a great blessing, a happy lot, for by annihilating and subduing my faculties, passions, and affections, the instruments of my low conceptions of God, I went forth on the scanty intercourse and operations of my own to those of God. That is, my intellect went forth out of itself, and from human became divine. For united to God in that purgation, it understands no more within its former limits and narrow bounds, but in the divine wisdom to which it is united. My will went forth out of itself, transformed into the divine will, for now, united with the divine love, it loves no more with its former scanty powers and circumscribed capacity, but with the energy and pureness of the divine Spirit. Thus the will acts no more in the things of God in a human way, and the memory also is transformed into the eternal apprehensions of glory. Finally, all the energies and affections of the soul are, in this night in purgation of the old man, renewed into a divine temper and delight. End of section 19. Section 20 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Chapter 5. Obscure contemplation is not a night only, but pain and torment also for the soul. In an obscure night. This obscure night is a certain inflowing of God into the soul, which cleanses it of its ignorance and imperfections, habitual, natural, and spiritual. Contemplatives call it infused contemplation, or mystical theology, whereby God secretly teaches the soul and instructs it in the perfection of love, without efforts on its own part beyond loving attention to God, listening to His voice and admitting the light He sends without understanding how this is infused contemplation. It is the loving wisdom of God that produces special effects in the soul, for it prepares, by enlightening it for union with God in love, that loving wisdom, which by enlightening purifies the blessed spirits, is that which here purifies and enlightens the soul. But it may be said, why do we call the divine light, which enlightens the soul and purges it of its ignorances, the obscure night? I reply, that the divine wisdom is, for two reasons, not night and darkness only, but pain and torment also to the soul. The first is, the divine wisdom is so high that it transcends the capacity of the soul, and therefore is, in that respect, darkness. The second reason is based on the meanness and impurity of the soul, and in that respect the divine wisdom is painful to it, afflictive, and obscure also. To prove the truth of the first reason, we assume a principle of philosophy, namely, the more clear and self-evident divine things are, the more obscure and hidden they are to the soul naturally. Thus, the more clear the light, the more does it blind the eyes of the owl, and the stronger the sun's rays, the greater the darkness of our visual organs. For the sun, in its own strength shining, overcomes them by reason of their weakness and deprives them of the power of seeing. So when the divine light of contemplation shines into the soul, not yet perfectly enlightened, it causes spiritual darkness, because it not only surpasses its strength, but because it obscures it and deprives it of its natural perceptions. It is for this reason that St. Dionysius and other mystic theologians call infused contemplation a ray of darkness, that is, for the unenlightened and unpurified soul, because the great supernatural light of contemplation overcomes the forces of the natural intellect and deprives it of its natural way of understanding. David also hath said the same thing. Clouds and darkness are round about him. Not that this is so in reality, but in reference to our weak understanding, which, in light so great, becomes obscure and blind, unable to ascend so high. And in another place the same truth is declared. At the brightness that was before him, the clouds passed between him and our understanding. This is the reason why the illuminating ray of hidden wisdom, when God sends it from himself into the soul not yet transformed, produces obscure darkness in the intellect. This obscure contemplation is, in its beginnings, painful also to the soul. For as the infused divine contemplation contains many excellences in the highest degree, and the soul, which is the recipient, because not yet pure, is involved in many miseries, the result is, as two contraries cannot coexist in the same subject, that the soul must suffer and be in pain, being the subject in which the two contraries meet, and resist each other because of the purgation of the soul from its imperfections, which is being effected by contemplation. I shall show this to be the case by the following induction. In the first place, because the light and wisdom of contemplation is most pure and clear, and because the soul, within which it shines, is impure and dark, that soul which is the recipient must greatly suffer. Eyes afflicted by humours suffer pain when the clear light shines upon them, and the pain of the soul, by reasons of its impurity, is immense when the divine light shines upon it. And when the rays of this pure light strike upon the soul, in order to expel its impurities, the soul perceives itself to be so unclean and miserable that it seems as if God had set himself against it, and itself were set against God. So grievous and painful is this feeling, for the soul feels as if God had abandoned it, that it was one of the heaviest afflictions of Job when he was in his trial. Why hast thou set me opposite to thee, and I become burdensome to myself? The soul sees distinctly in this clear and pure light, though obscurely, its own impurity, and acknowledges its own unworthiness before God and all creatures. And what pains it still more is the fear it has that it will never cease to be unworthy, and that all its goodness is gone. This is the fruit of that profound depression under which the mind labours in the knowledge and sense of its own wickedness and misery. For now the divine and obscure light reveals to it all its wretchedness, and it sees clearly that of itself it can never be otherwise. To the same effect are the following words of the psalmist. For iniquities thou hast chastised man, and thou hast made his soul pine away as a spider. In the second place, the pain of the soul has its sources in its natural and spiritual weakness. For when the divine contemplation flows within it with a certain vehemence, in order to strengthen it and subdue it, it is then so pained in its weakness as almost to faint away, particularly at those times when the divine contemplation seizes upon it with a greater degree of vehemence. For sense and spirit, as if bowed down by a heavy and dark burden, suffer and groan in agony so great that death itself would be a relief. This was the experience of Job when he cried, I will not that he contend with me with much strength, nor that he oppress me with the weight of his greatness. The soul bowed down by the burden of oppression feels itself so removed out of God's favour that it thinks, and it is so in truth, that all things which consoled it formerly have utterly failed it, and that no one is left to pity it. Job, in like circumstances, has said, "Have pity upon me, have pity upon me, at least you, my friends, because the hand of the Lord hath touched me." Wonderful and piteous sight! So great are the weakness and impurity of the soul, that the hand of God, so soft and so gentle, is felt to be so heavy and oppressive, though neither pressing nor resting upon it, but merely touching it, and that too in mercy. For he touches the soul not to chastise it, but to lead it to his graces. End of section 20. Section 21 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 6. Other Sufferings of the Soul in this Night. The third suffering and affliction of the soul is the consequence of the meeting of the two extremes together, the human and the divine. The latter being the purgative contemplation, the human being the soul itself. When the divine touches the soul to renew it and to ripen it so as to make it divine, to detach it from its habitual afflictions and qualities of the old man, to which it clings and adheres most closely, it so breaks and bruises it, swallowing it up in profound darkness, that the soul seems to perish and waste away at the sight of its own wretchedness by a cruel spiritual death. It feels as if it were swallowed up and devoured by a wild beast, suffering the pangs of Jonas in the belly of the whale. For it must lie buried in the grave of this obscure death, that it may attain to the spiritual resurrection for which it hopes. David describes the nature of this pain and suffering, though it really baffles description, saying, "The sorrows of death surround me. The sorrows of hell encompassed me. In my affliction I called upon the Lord, and I cried to my God." But the greatest affliction of the soul in this state is the thought that God has abandoned it, of which it has no doubt, that he has cast it away into darkness as an abominable thing. This belief in its own abandonment is a most grievous and pitiable affliction. David experienced the same trials when he said, "Like the slain sleeping in the sepulchres, of whom thou art mindful no more, and they are cast off from thy hand. They have laid me in the lower pit, in the dark places, and in the shadow of death. Thy wrath is strong over me, and all thy waves thou hast brought in upon me." For in truth, when the soul is in the pangs of purgative contemplation, the shadow of death and the pangs of hell are most acutely felt, for these consist in the sense of its being without God, that he has abandoned it in his wrath and cast it down beneath the burden of his heavy displeasure. All this and even more the soul feels, for a fearful apprehension has come upon it that thus it will be with it forever. It also has the same sense of abandonment with respect to all creatures, and that it is an object of contempt to all, especially to its friends. And so the psalmist continues, saying, "Thou hast put away my acquaintance far from me. They have set me an abomination to themselves." The prophet Jonas also, as one who had experience of this, both bodily and spiritually, witnesses to the same truth, saying, "Thou hast cast me forth into the deep, in the heart of the sea, and a flood hath compassed me. All thy billows and thy waves have passed over me, and I said, I am cast away out of the sight of thine eyes, but yet I shall see thy holy temple again." This is the purgation of the soul, that it may see God. "The waters have compassed me about, even to the soul. The deep hath enclosed me, the sea hath covered my head. I went down to the lowest part of the mountains. The bars of the earth have shut me up forever." The bars of the earth are the imperfections of the soul, which prevent it from the enjoyment of this sweet contemplation. The fourth kind of pain is caused by another excellence peculiar to this obscure contemplation, the sense of God's majesty and greatness. This makes the soul conscious of the other extreme, its own poverty and misery, and this is one of the chief sufferings of this purgation. The soul is made conscious of a profound emptiness and an utter destitution of the three kinds of goods, natural, temporal, and spiritual, which are ordained for its comfort. It sees itself in the midst of the opposite evils, miserable imperfections and aridities, its faculties devoid of all apprehensions, and the spirit abandoned in darkness. And, inasmuch as God is now purifying it in its sensitive and spiritual substance, in its interior and exterior powers, it is necessary for it that it should become empty, poor and abandoned, arid, destitute and obscured. For the sensitive part is purified in aridities, the faculties in the absence of all apprehensions, and the spirit in the obscure darkness. Now God effects this by means of obscure contemplation, wherein the soul not only suffers from the absence and suspension of all natural support and apprehensions, which is a most painful trial, like a person held by the throat and suffocated, but all its affections and the imperfect habits contracted in the world are also purged away, annihilated, emptied out of it, or consumed within it, as the rust and mold of metal is burnt away in the fire. But, as these things are most deeply rooted in the soul, the sufferings and interior trials which it has to endure are heavy, and in addition to the destitution and emptiness, natural and spiritual, of which I have spoken. The words of the prophet are now fulfilled. Heap together the bones, which I will burn with fire. The flesh shall be consumed, and the whole mixture shall be sodden, and the bones shall dry away. This describes the path which the soul suffers in the sensitive and spiritual parts when it is in this state of emptiness and poverty. And so the prophet proceeds, saying, Set it also empty upon hot burning coals, that the brass thereof may wax hot and be melted, and let the filth of it be melted in the midst thereof, and let the rust thereof be consumed. This is the heavy trial of the soul in the purifying fires of contemplation. The prophet says that, in order to purge away and consume the filth of the afflictions which are within the soul, it is necessary for it, in a certain way, to be annihilated and undone, because its passions and affections have become natural to it. And therefore the soul, because it is purified in this furnace, like gold in a crucible, according to the words of wisdom, as gold in the furnace he hath proved them, feels itself consumed away in its innermost substance, in this absolute poverty wherein it is as if it were lost. This truth is clearly taught us by the psalmist, saying, Save me, O God, for the waters are come in even unto my soul. I stick fast in the deep mire, and there is no sure standing. I am come into the depth of the sea, and a tempest hath overwhelmed me. I am weary of crying, my jaws are made hoarse, my eyes have failed, whilst I hope in my God. Here God is humbling the soul, that he may exalt it hereafter, and if it were not his will that these feelings, when they rise, should be quickly lulled again, the soul would almost immediately depart from the body. But they occur only at intervals, in their greatest violence. They are occasionally so acute that the soul seems to see hell and perdition open before it. They who are in this state are those who go down alive into hell, and have their purgatory in this life, for this is the purgation to be endured there for venial sins. And thus he who passes through this state in the present life, and is purified, either enters not into purgatory, or is detained there but a moment, for 1 hour here is more than many there. End of section 21. Section 22 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 7. The same subject continued. Other afflictions and trials of the will. The afflictions of the will and its trials here are also immense. They occasionally pierce the soul with a sudden recollection of the evils that environ it, and of the uncertainty of any relief. To this is superadded the memory of past happiness, for souls of this kind, when they enter into the night, have, generally, had much sweetness in God, and served Him greatly. But now, to see themselves strangers to so much happiness, and unable to recover it, causes them the greatest affliction. This was the experience of Job also, for he said, I, sometime that wealthy one, suddenly am broken. He hath held my neck, broken me, and set me to himself, as it were a mark. He hath compassed me with his spears, he hath wounded my loins, he hath not spared, and hath poured out my bowels on the earth. He hath torn me with wound upon wound. He hath rushed in upon me like a giant. I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin, and have covered my flesh with ashes. My face is swollen with weeping, and my eyelids are dim. So many and so great are the torments of this night, and so many are the illustrations of them furnished by the holy writings, that time and strength would fail me, were I to attempt to enumerate them. For beyond all doubt, all that can be said of them will fall short, and the illustration before us will enable us to form conjecture as to the others. And now, to conclude the subject of the first line of the stanza, and to show what this night is to the soul, I will repeat here what the prophet Jeremiah has said of it. I am the man that sees my poverty in the rod of his indignation. He hath led and brought me into darkness, and not into light. Only against me he hath turned again and again his hand all the day. He hath made my skin and my flesh old, he hath broken my bones. He hath built around me, and he hath compassed me with gall and hardship. In dark places he hath placed me as the everlasting dead. He hath built round about against me, that I go not forth. He hath made my fetters heavy. Yes, and when I cry and ask, he shutteth out my prayer. He hath shut up my ways with square stones. He hath made my path crooked. He is come to me as a bear lying in wait, as a lion in secret places. He hath turned aside my paths, and hath broken me. He hath made me desolate. He hath bent his bow, and hath sent me a mark for the arrow. He hath shot into my reins the daughters of his quiver. I am made a laughingstock to all my people, their song all the day. He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath inebriated me with wormwood, and he hath broken my teeth one by one. He hath fed me with ashes, and my soul is repelled from peace. I have forgotten good things, and I said, my end and my hope is perished from the Lord. Remember my poverty and transgression, the wormwood and the gall. I am mindful and remember, and my soul languisheth within me. These lamentations of the prophet, which so vividly depict the sufferings of the soul, refer to those trials and afflictions which come upon it in this purgation and spiritual night. That soul is worthy of all compassion which God leads into this dreadful and horrible night. For, although it is well within it because of the great blessing in store, and of which this night is the source, since God will raise up good things for it out of this darkness, and bring light over the shadow of death, as it is written, He discovereth deep things out of darkness, and bringeth up to light the shadow of death, so that His light shall be as extensive as the darkness that is past. The darkness thereof and the light thereof are alike. Nevertheless, on account of the immense sufferings it endures, and the great uncertainty of any relief, for it imagines that its calamities will never come to an end, God having made it to dwell in darkness as those that have been dead of old, the spirit is in anguish within it, and the heart within it is troubled. Its condition is one of deep suffering, and greatly to be pitied. Besides, the soul derives now no consolation from the advice that may be given it, or from its spiritual director, because of the loneliness and desolation which overwhelm it in this obscure night. though its confessor may set before it in many ways the grounds of comfort which are to be had in the blessings which these its sufferings imply, yet the soul will not believe him. For being absorbed in the sense of the evils that environ it, and seeing clearly its own misery, it imagines that its spiritual director, not seeing what itself sees and feels, speaks as he does without comprehending its case. It is pained anew instead of being comforted, for it considers that his counsel is no remedy of the evil it suffers from, which is most true. For no relief, no remedy is possible for that pain. This is the more so, inasmuch as the soul is powerless here, like a prisoner in his dark cell, bound hand and foot, unable to move or see, and shut out from all help whatever, until our Lord shall have accomplished the purgation of the soul in his own way, until the spirit is softened, humbled, and purified, until it becomes so refined, simple, and pure as to become one with the Spirit of God in that degree of the union of love which he in his mercy intends for it, and corresponding to which is the greater or less violence, the longer or shorter duration of this purgation. But if this purgation is to be real, it will last, notwithstanding its vehemence, for some years, but admitting of intermissions and relief, during which, by the dispensations of God, the obscure contemplation, divested of its purgative form and character, assumes that of the illuminative and of love. Under this form of it, the soul, like one escaped from the dungeons of its prison into the comfort of space and freedom, enjoys the sweetness of peace and the loving tenderness of God in the flowing abundance of spiritual communications. This is to the soul a sign of the spiritual health which is being wrought within by this purgation, and a foretaste of the abundance it hopes for. So much so is this at times that it thinks all its trials are over. For such is the nature of spiritual things, when they are most purely spiritual, that when trials return, the soul thinks they will never end, and that all its goodness has perished, and when it prospers in its spiritual course, it thinks that all its calamities are past, and that it shall always abound in good things. Thus it was with David when he said, "In my abundance I said, I shall never be moved." The reason of this is that the actual enjoyment of one thing in the mind is inconsistent with the enjoyment of its contrary. But this is not the case quite in the sensitive part of the soul, because of the weakness of its apprehensions. But as the spirit is not yet wholly purified and cleansed from the afflictions of the inferior nature, though more resolute and consistent now, it is still liable to pains, so far as it is under the dominion of these affections. This is evident in the life of David, for when his state changed, he was in affliction, though he had said, in the day of prosperity, "I shall never be moved." Thus the soul, in the actual enjoyment of spiritual blessings, but not observing the radical imperfections and impurities which still remain, thinks that all its trials are over. This thought, however, is of rare occurrence. For until the spiritual purgation is complete, the sweet communications of God are rarely so abundant as to conceal the root that remains behind, in such a way that the soul shall not be profoundly conscious of some deficiency, or that something still is to be done. Nor is the communication such as to allow it to enjoy the relief that is offered it perfectly, for it feels that there is an enemy lurking within, who, though he may be subdued and lulled, will yet return in his strength and assault it as before. And so it comes to pass, for when the soul is most secure, it is then plunged at once into another affliction, heavier, darker, and sadder than the previous one, and which, perhaps, will be of longer continuance. The soul again is convinced that all goodness is gone from it forever. Experience cannot teach it. The blessings that flowed out of its former trials, during which it thought that its sufferings would never end, cannot prevent it from believing, in its present trials, that all goodness has perished from it, and that it will never be again as it was before. The present convictions are so strong, grounded on actual feelings, as to destroy within it all the occasions of joy. Thus the soul in this purgation, though it seeks to please God, and is ready to die for him 1,000 deaths, for souls thus tried love God with great sincerity, nevertheless finds no relief, but rather an increase of pain herein. For seeking God alone to the exclusion of aught else, and seeing its own miserableness to be so great, it doubts whether God is not angry with it. It cannot then persuade itself that there is anything in it worthy of love, but rather is convinced that there is that in it which should make it hateful, not only in the eyes of God, but of all creatures also forever. It grieves to see within itself sufficient grounds why it should be abandoned of him whom it so loves and so longs for. End of section 22. Section 23 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 8. Other Trials of the Soul in this State. Another source of affliction and distress to the soul in this state is that, as the obscure night impedes the exercise of faculties and affections, it cannot elevate the mind and affections to God as before, nor pray to him. It thinks itself to be in that state described by the prophet, when he said, "Thou hast set a cloud before thee, that our prayer may not pass through." This is the meaning of the words I have quoted before. He hath shut up my ways with square stones. If at any time it prays with so much aridity, without sweetness, as to think that God neither hears nor regards it, as the prophet complains, saying, "Yea, and when I cry and entreat, he shutteth out my prayer." And in truth, this is the time for the soul to put its mouth in the dust, suffering in patience this purgation. It is God himself who is now working in the soul, and the soul is therefore powerless. It cannot pray or give great attention to divine things, neither can it attend to temporal matters, for it falls into frequent distractions, and the memory is so profoundly weakened that many hours pass by at a time without its knowing what it has done or thought, what it is doing or about to do, nor can it give the least heed to what it is occupied with, notwithstanding all its efforts. Inasmuch, then, as the intellect is purified from its imperfect perceptions, the will from its affections, and the memory also from all knowledge and reflections, it is necessary that the soul should be annihilated herein, according to the words of the psalmist, referring to this purgation. "I am brought to nothing, and I knew not." This knowing not extends to these follies and failures of the memory. These wanderings and failures of memory are the result of interior recollection, by which the soul is absorbed in contemplation. In order to prepare the soul, and temper it divinely in all its powers for the divine union of love, it must, first of all, be absorbed with all its powers in the divine obscure spiritual light of contemplation, and detached from all affection for, and apprehension of, created things. This continues regularly in proportion to the intensity of its contemplation. Thus, then, the more pure and simple the divine light when it shines on the soul, the more does it obscure it, empty it, and annihilate it, as to all its apprehensions and affections, whether they regard heavenly or earthly things. And also, the less pure and simple the light, the less is the soul obscured and annihilated. It seems strange to say that the purer and the clearer the supernatural light, the more is the soul obscured, and that it is less obscured when that light is less pure. But this may be easily explained if we keep in mind the philosophical axiom that supernatural things are more obscure to the intellect the more clear they are in themselves. Thus the ray of high contemplation, transcending as it does the natural powers, shining on the soul with its divine light, makes it dark, and deprives it of all the natural affections and apprehensions which it entertained in its own natural light. Under these circumstances, the soul is not only left in darkness, but in emptiness also, as to its powers and desires, both natural and spiritual, and in this emptiness and obscurity is purified and enlightened by the divine spiritual light, without its ever thinking of its presence, but rather thinking of the darkness that surrounds it. As a pure ray of light, unreflected by any object, is almost invisible, but becomes visible by being reflected, so the spiritual light which envelops the soul is, by reason of its pureness, invisible or imperceptible. But when it strikes against any object, that is, when we use it to discern between truth and falsehood, or any particular matter relating to perfection, it then becomes visible at once, and the soul perceives it then much more distinctly than it did before it entered this obscurity. In the same way it perceives the spiritual light which it has for discerning easily the imperfection which is present, as in the case of a ray of light, which is itself not visible, but which, if the hand or any object be passed across its course, the hand becomes instantly visible, and the presence of the sun's light is detected. The soul, therefore, inasmuch as this light is perfectly pure, clear, and universal, disconnected from all particular objects of the intellect, natural or divine, its powers are emptied and annihilated with respect to all such apprehensions, most easily and comprehensively understands and penetrates within all things, whether of heaven or of earth, according to the saying of the Apostle, "The Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God." It is to this universal and pure knowledge these words refer, which the wise man spoke by the Holy Ghost. Wisdom reacheth everywhere, by reason of her purity. That is, because not connected with any particular object of the intellect or affections. The characteristic of a mind purified and annihilated as to all particular objects of affection and of the intellect is said to have pleasure in nothing, and to have no particular understanding, abiding in emptiness, obscurity, and darkness, embracing all things in its grand comprehensiveness, fulfilling mystically the words of the Apostle, having nothing and possessing all things, for such poverty of spirit merits such a blessing. End of section 23. Section 24 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 9. How it is that this night enlightens the mind, while it brings darkness over it. It remains for me now to explain that this blessed night, though it obscures the mind, does so only to enlighten it, and though it humbles it and makes it miserable, does so only for the purpose of exalting and setting it free. And though it impoverishes and empties it of all it holds, it does so only to enable it to reach forward divinely to the possession and fruition of all things, both of heaven and earth, in perfect liberty of spirit. As the primary elements which enter into the composition of all natural substances have no color, taste, or smell peculiar to themselves, so that they shall combine with all colors, all tastes, and all smell, so the mind must be pure, simple, and detached from all natural affections, actual and habitual, in order that it may freely participate in the largeness of spirit of the divine wisdom, whereby, by reason of its pureness, it tastes of the sweetness of all things in a certain preeminent way. And without this purgation, it is altogether impossible to taste of the abundance of these spiritual delights. For one single affection remaining in the soul, to which the mind may cling either habitually or actually, is sufficient to prevent all perception and all communication of the interior sweetness of the spirit of love, which contains within itself all sweetness supremely. As the children of Israel, merely on account of that single affection or remembrance which they retained of the flesh-pots of Egypt, could not taste the delicious bread of angels, the manna in the desert, which had the sweetness of every taste, and turned to what every man liked, so the mind which still clings actually or habitually to any one affection or particular mode of apprehending cannot taste the sweetness of the spirit of liberty, according to the desire of the will. The reason is this: the affections, feelings, and apprehensions of the perfect spirit, being of so high an order and specially divine, are of another and different kind than those which are natural, and in order to be actually and habitually enjoyed, require the annihilation of the latter. It is therefore expedient and necessary, if the soul is to advance to these heights, that the obscure night of contemplation should annihilate it first, and destroy it in all its meanness, changing it into darkness, aridities, loneliness, and emptiness. For the light that is given it is a certain divine light of the highest nature, surpassing all natural light, and not cognizable by the natural intellect. If the intellect is to be united with that light, and become divinely transformed in the state of perfection, it must first of all be purified and annihilated as to its natural light, which must be brought actually into darkness by means of obscure contemplation. This obscurity must continue so long as it is necessary to destroy the habit, long ago contracted, of understanding things in a human way, and until the divine enlightening shall have taken its place. And inasmuch as the power of understanding, previously exerted, was natural, the darkness now endured is profound, awful, and most afflictive, because it reaches to, and is felt in, the innermost depths of the spirit. And inasmuch as the affection of love, communicated in the divine union, is divine, and therefore most spiritual, subtle, delicate, and most interior, surpassing all natural sense and affection, the imperfectness of the will and every desire of the same, it is necessary for the fruition, in the union of love, of this divine affection and most exquisite delight, that the will should be first purified and annihilated, as to all its affections and feelings, left in darkness and distress, proportional to the intensity of the habit of natural affections it had acquired, in respect both of human and divine things. And this must be done in order that the will, in the fire of obscure contemplation, wasted, withered, and deprived of all selfishness, like the liver of the fish on the burning coals, may acquire a pure and simple disposition, a purified and sound taste, so as to feel those sublime and wonderful touches of divine love whenever it shall be divinely transformed, and wherein all its former contrarieties, actual and habitual, shall be expelled. Moreover, in order to attain to the divine union, for which obscure contemplation disposes it, the soul must be endowed and replenished with a certain glorious magnificence in the divine communication, which includes innumerable blessings and joys, surpassing all the abundance which the soul can naturally possess. So speak the prophet Isaiah and St. Paul. Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man what things God hath prepared for them that love him. It is necessary for it that it should be first brought into a state of emptiness and spiritual poverty, detached from all help and consolation, in all the things of heaven and earth, that being thus empty, it may be really poor in spirit and divested of the old man, and may live that new and blessed life to which it attains in this obscure contemplation, which is the state of union with God. And because the soul is to attain to a certain sense, to a certain divine knowledge, most generous and full of sweetness, of all human and divine things which do not fall within the common sense and natural perceptions of the soul, it views them with different eyes now, for the light and grace of the Holy Ghost differ from those of sense, the divine from the human. It is necessary that the mind should be brought low, and inured to hardships in all that relates to natural and common sense. It must suffer hardships and afflictions in the purgative contemplation, and the memory must become a stranger to all pleasing and peaceful notions, with a most interior sense and feeling of being a stranger and a pilgrim here, so that all things shall seem strange to it, and other than they were wont to seem. It must suffer hardships and afflictions in the purgative contemplation, and the memory must become a stranger to all pleasing and peaceful notions, with a most interior sense and feeling of being a stranger and a pilgrim here, so that all things shall seem strange to it, and other than they were wont to seem. For this night is drawing the mind away from its ordinary and common sense of things, and attracts it toward the divine sense, which is a stranger and an alien to all human ways. So much so that the soul seems to be carried out of itself. At other times it looks upon itself as if under the influence of some spell, and is amazed at all that is around it, all that it hears and sees, which seem to it to be most strange, though in reality always the same. The sources of this feeling are that the soul has become a stranger to the ordinary sense of things, in order that being brought to nothing therein, it might be formed divinely anew. Now this belongs more to the next life than to this. The soul suffers these afflictive purgations of the spirit that it may be born again to the life of the spirit through the divine influence. And in these pangs brings forth the spirit of salvation, fulfilling the words of the prophet, "So are we become in thy presence, O Lord. We have conceived, and been as it were in labor, and brought forth the spirit of salvation." Moreover, as the night of contemplation disposes the soul for that tranquillity and interior peace, which is so full of delight, as in the words of the Scripture, to surpass all understanding, it is necessary that the former peace of the soul, which, because involved in so many imperfections, was no peace, though it seemed to be a twofold peace, namely of sense and spirit, should first of all be purified, and the soul disturbed and repelled from that imperfect peace, as Jeremias felt and lamented in the words cited before, to express the trials of the night that is now past, namely, "My soul is repelled off from peace." This is a painful unsettling, full of misgivings, imaginations, and interior struggles, to which the soul, at the sight and in the consciousness of its own misery, imagines itself to be lost, and all the goodness to have utterly perished. In this state the mind is pierced by sorrow so profound to occasion spiritual groans and cries. At times it gives audible vent to them, and tears break forth, if there be any strength left, though this relief is but rarely granted. The royal prophet has well described this state, being one who had experience of it, saying, "I am afflicted and humbled exceedingly. I roared with the groaning of my heart." This proceeds from great sorrow, for sometimes the sudden and sharp recollection of the miseries that environ the soul produces such pain and suffering that I know not how to describe them otherwise than by the words of Job. "As overflowing waters, so is my roaring. For as waters sometimes overflow, drown, and fill all places, so this roaring, this sense of pain, occasionally so grows as to overflow the soul and drown it, so fills all its affections and energies with spiritual sorrows as to defy all exaggeration." Such is the work wrought in this night that hideth the hopes of day. It was in reference to it that Job said, "In the night my mouth is pierced with sorrows, and they that feed upon me do not sleep." The mouth is the will, pierced by these sorrows, which ceases not to tear the soul. Neither do they sleep, for the doubts and misgivings which harass it give it no rest. This warfare and combat are deep, because the peace hoped for is most deep. The spiritual sorrow is most interior, refined and pure, because the love to be enjoyed is most interior and pure. The more interior and perfect the work, the more interior, perfect, and pure must be the labor that produces it, and the stronger the building, the deeper the foundation. "My soul fadeth within myself," saith Job, "and the days of affliction possess me." So in the same way, because the soul has to attain to the enjoyment and possession, in the state of perfection to which it journeys in this purgative night, of innumerable blessings, gifts, and virtues, both in the substance of the soul and in the powers thereof, it is necessary for it that it should consider and feel itself deprived of them all, and regard them as so far beyond its reach as to be persuaded that it never can attain to them, and that all goodness is perished from it. This is the meaning of those words of the prophet, "I have forgotten good things." Let us see why it is that the light of contemplation, so sweet and lovely to the soul that nothing is more desirable, for it is that whereby the divine union takes place, and whereby the soul in the state of perfection finds all the good it desires, produces these painful beginnings and awful results. The answer is easy, and is already given in part. This is not the effect of contemplation and the divine inflowing, from which comes sweetness rather than pain. The cause is in our imperfection and weakness, and in the dispositions of our souls, which is not fit for the reception of that sweetness. And so, when the divine light shines in upon the soul, it makes it suffer in the way described. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 10. Explanation of this Purgation by a Comparison. To make what I have said, and what I have still to say, more clear, I find it necessary here to observe that this purgative and loving knowledge, or divine light, is to the soul, which it is purifying, in order to unite itself perfectly to itself, as fire is to fuel, which is transforming into itself. The first action of material fire on fuel is to dry it, to expel from it all water and all moisture. It then blackens it and soils it, and drying it by little and little makes it light, and consumes away its accidental defilements, which are contrary to itself. Finally, having heated and set on fire its outward surface, it transforms the whole into itself, and makes it beautiful as itself. Thus fuel, subject to the action of fire, retains neither active nor passive qualities of its own, except bulk and specific weight, and assumes all the qualities of fire. It becomes dry, then it glows, and glowing burns, luminous it gives light, and burns much lighter than before. All this is the effect of fire. We theorize in this way concerning the divine fire of contemplative love, which, before it unites with and transforms the soul into itself, purges away all its contrary qualities. It expels its impurities, blackens it and obscures it, and renders its condition apparently worse than it was before. For while the divine purgation is removing all the evil and vicious humours, which, because so deeply rooted and settled in the soul, were neither seen nor felt, but now, in order to their expulsion and annihilation, are rendered clearly visible in the obscure light of the divine contemplation, the soul, though not worse in itself nor in the sight of God, seeing at last what it never saw before, looks upon itself not only as unworthy of the divine regard, but even as a loathsome object in the eyes of God. The comparison which I have instituted will enable us to understand what I have said, and what I purpose still to say. In the first place, we see how the very light, and that loving knowledge which unites the soul and transforms it into itself, is the same which purifies and prepares it. For the fire that transforms the fuel and incorporates it with itself is the very same which also at the first prepared it for that end. In the second place, the sufferings of the soul here do not proceed from the divine wisdom, it being written, "All good things came to me together with her," but from its own weakness and imperfection, from its being incapable, previous to its purgation, of receiving this divine light, sweetness, and delight. This is the source of its sufferings. So the fuel too is not transformed into fire at the instant of their contact, if it be not previously prepared for burning. This is the experience of the wise man, who thus describes his sufferings before his union with and possession of wisdom. "My entrails were troubled in seeking her. Therefore I shall possess a good possession." In the third place, we learn incidentally how souls suffer in purgatory. The fire would have no power over them if they were perfectly prepared for the kingdom of God, and union with Him in glory, if they had no faults to expiate, which are the matter on which the fire seizes. For when that matter is consumed, there is nothing more to burn. So it is here. When all perfections are removed, the suffering of the soul ceases, and in its place comes joy as deep as it is possible for it to be in this life. In the fourth place, we learn that the soul, the more it is purified and cleansed in the fire of love, the more it glows with it. The more the fuel is prepared for the fire, the more it burns, though the soul is not always conscious of this burning of love within it, but only now and then, when the ray of contemplation shines upon it not so strongly. Then the soul is enabled to see, and even to enjoy, the work that is going on. It seems as if the hand of the artificer was withdrawn from the work, and the iron taken out of the furnace, so as to show in some measure the work that is being wrought. Then, too, the soul may see in itself that good which it could not see while the process was going on. Thus, when the flame ceases to envelop the fuel it burns, we see clearly how much of it has been enkindled. In the fifth place, we learn how it is that, after alleviations of its pains, the soul suffers again more intensely and sensibly than before. For after the manifestation of the work that has been done, when the outward imperfections have been expelled, the fire of love returns again to purge and consume away that which is interior. Now the suffering of the soul becomes more penetrating, deep, and spiritual, according as it refines away the more profound, subtle, and deeply rooted interior imperfections of the spirit. It is here, as with the fuel in the fire, the deeper the fire penetrates, the greater is its force and energy in disposing the inmost substance of the fuel for its own possession of it. In the sixth place, we learn that the soul, though it rejoices intensely in these intervals of peace, so much so that it seems to think its trials over, never to return, even while it is certain that they will soon recur again, cannot but feel, if it observes a single root of imperfection behind, that it is sometimes observed, that its rejoicing is incomplete. It seems as if that root threatened to spring up anew, and when that is the case, it does so quickly. Finally, that which remains to be purified and enlightened cannot now be concealed from the soul in the presence of what has been already purified. Thus the portion of the material fuel which is still to be set on fire is very different from that which the flame has purified. And when this purgation commences anew in the inmost soul, it is not strange that it should consider all its goodness to have perished, and that it can never recover its former prosperity. For in these most interior sufferings, all exterior goodness becomes invisible. Keeping this illustration, then, before our eyes, and remembering what I have said on the first line of this stanza concerning this obscure night and its fearful characteristics, it may be as well to abandon the subject of these afflictions of the soul, and to enter on the matter of the fruit of its tears and their blessed issues, celebrated by the soul in the following lines. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 11. A vehement passion of divine love, the fruit of these sharp afflictions of the soul. With anxious love inflamed. Here the soul speaks of the fire of love, which, in the night of painful contemplation, seizes upon it as material fire on the fuel it burns. This burning, though to a certain extent resembling that which takes place in the sensitive part of the soul, is still, in one sense, as different from it as the soul is different from the body, the spiritual from the sensitive. For this is a certain fire of love in the spirit whereby the soul, in its dark trials, feels itself wounded to the quick by a certain impression and foretaste of God, though it understands nothing distinctly, because the intellect is in darkness. The mind is now conscious of a deep affection of love, for this spiritual burning produces the passion of it. And inasmuch as this love is infused in a special way, the soul corresponds only passively with it, and thus a strong passion of love is begotten within it. This love has in it something of the most perfect union with God, and thus partakes in some measure of its qualities, which are chiefly actions of God, in the soul rather than of the soul, which is consenting unto them in simplicity and love. It is, however, the love of God only which, uniting itself with the soul, produces this warmth and force and temper and passion, or, as the soul calls it, burning. The more the desires are restrained, subdued, and disabled for the enjoyment of the things of heaven and earth, the more space does this love find for itself in the soul, and the better dispositions for its reception, so that it may unite itself with that soul, and wound it. This takes place during the dark purgation in a wonderful way, for God has so weaned the faculties, as they are now so recollected in him, that they are unable to take pleasure as they like, in anything whatever. All this is the work of God, wrought with a view to withdraw the faculties of the soul from all objects whatever, and to concentrate them upon himself, so that the soul may acquire greater strength and fitness for the strong union of love which God is communicating in the purgative way, and in which the soul must love him with all its strength, and with all the desires of sense and spirit, which it could never do if the faculties thereof were dissipated by other satisfactions. The psalmist prepared himself thus for the strong love of the divine union, for he said, "I will keep my strength for thee," that is, all my capacity, all the energy of my faculties and my desires, neither will I suffer them to rejoice in anything but thee. Here we may perceive in some degree how great and how vehement is this burning of love in the spirit, when God gathers and collects together all the strength, faculties and desires of the soul, spiritual and sensitive, so that their harmonious combination may direct all its energies and all its forces toward the real and perfect fulfillment of the first commandment of the law, which comprehends within its scope the whole nature and gifts of man, namely, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with thy whole soul, and with thy whole strength. When all the desires and energies of the soul are thus recollected in this burning of love, and the soul itself, touched, wounded, and set on fire with love, in them all, what must the movements and affections of these desires and energies be, when they are thus wounded and burning with love, when that love does not satiate them, when they are in darkness and doubt about it, and suffering also, beyond all question, a more grievous hunger after it, in proportion to the past experiences of it? For the touch of this love and of the divine fire so dries up the spirit and enkindles its desires for satisfying its thirst, that it turns upon itself 1,000 times, and longs for God in 1,000 ways, as David did when he said, "For thee my soul hath thirsted, for thee my flesh, oh how many ways," that is, in desire. Another version reads, "My soul thirsteth after thee, my soul is dying for thee." This is the reason why the soul says, "with anxious love inflamed." In all its works and thoughts, employments and opportunities, the soul loves in many ways, and longs after God. This longing is so manifold in its forms, always and everywhere abiding, that the soul has no rest, feeling itself to be wounded, inflamed with anxiety. Its then state is thus described by holy Job: "As the servant longeth for the shade, as the hireling looketh for the end of his work, so I also have had empty months, and have numbered to myself wearisome nights. If I lie down to sleep, I shall say, When shall I arise? And again I shall look for the evening, and I shall be filled with sorrows even till darkness." The soul is in perplexity. It cannot comprehend itself, neither the things of heaven nor earth, and is filled with sorrows even till darkness, which, taking the words of Job in their spiritual sense, adapted to the subject before us, is pain and suffering, without the hope of light, or of any spiritual good. The anxieties of the soul while on fire with love is very great, because of their twofold origin. The spiritual darkness which envelops it is one, and afflicts it with doubts and misgivings. The love of God itself which burns within it is the other, and that inflames it marvellously, and excites it through the loving wound it has inflicted upon it. These two and simultaneous anxieties are thus referred to by the prophet: "My soul hath desired thee in the night, that is, in my misery." This is one kind of pain which proceeds from the obscure night. "Yea, and with my spirit within me in the morning early, I will watch to thee." This is the other suffering of desire and anxiety, which proceeds from love in the bowels of the spirit, that is, the spiritual affections. The soul, however, is conscious, amidst these obscure and loving anxieties, of a certain companionship therein and interior strength, which is so great that, If the burden of this oppressive obscurity were removed, it would oftentimes feel itself desolate, empty, and weak. The reason is that the force and courage of the soul flow passively from the obscure fire of love, and so when that fire ceases to envelop it, the darkness, the strength, and the fire of love cease at the same time. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Obscure Night by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 12. How this awful night is like purgatory. How the divine wisdom illuminates men on earth with that light in which the angels are purified and enlightened in heaven. What I have said enables us to see how the obscure night of loving fire purifies the soul in the darkness, and in the darkness also sets it on fire. We shall also see that, as the dark and material fires in the next life, so the loving, dark, and spiritual fires here purify and cleanse the predestinate. The difference is that in the next world men are purified by fire, and here purified and enlightened by love. David prayed for this love when he said, "Create a clean heart in me, O God." For cleanness of heart is nothing else but the love and grace of God. Blessed are the clean of heart, saith our Saviour, and it is as if he had said, Blessed are those who love, for blessedness can come of nothing less than love. The following words of the prophet also. From on high he hath cast a fire in my bones, and hath taught me, show plainly that the soul is purified and enlightened in the fire of loving wisdom, for God never grants the mystical wisdom without love, it being love itself that infuses it into the soul. David also saith that the wisdom of God is silver tried in the purifying fire of love. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried by fire. Obscure contemplation infuses into the soul love and wisdom simultaneously, to everyone according to his necessity and capacity, enlightening the soul and cleansing it of all its ignorances, according to the words of the wise man, He hath enlightened my ignorances. Here also we learn that the wisdom which purifies the ignorance of the angels, flowing from God through the highest down to the lowest, in the order of the heavenly hierarchy, and thence to men, is that very wisdom which purifies and enlightens the human soul. All the works of the angels, and all the inspirations they suggest, are, in Holy Scripture, truly and properly said to be their work and God's. For, ordinarily, his inspirations flow through the angels who receive them, each choir from the other instantaneously, as the light of the sun penetrates many windows at once, arranged one behind the other. It is quite true that, in one sense, the light of the sun pierces all, yet each window conveys that light to the next, modified according to the nature of the glass which transmits it, and somewhat weaker according to the distance from the sun. Hence it follows, with respect to the higher and lower angels, the nearer they are to God, the more they are purified and enlightened in the general purgation, the lowest in rank receiving their illumination in a less perfect degree. But man, being lower than the angels, must, when God raises him to the state of contemplation, receive that enlightenment according to his capacity in a limited degree, and with suffering. For the light of God which illuminates an angel enlightens him, and sets him on fire with love, for he is a spirit already prepared for the infusion of that light. But man, being impure and weak, is ordinarily enlightened in obscurity, distressingly and painfully, as the sun's rays are painful to weak eyes, till the fire of love shall have spiritualized and refined him, so that being made pure, like the angels, he may be able to receive with sweetness the union of God's inflowing love. There are souls who, in this life, are more perfectly enlightened than even angels. But in the meantime, this contemplation and loving knowledge come upon the soul through trials and loving anxiety. The soul is not always conscious of this burning and anxiety of love, For in the beginning of the spiritual purgation, all the divine fire is employed in drying up and preparing the soul, rather than in setting it on fire. But when the soul has become heated in the fire, it then feels most commonly this burning and warmth of love. And now, as the intellect is being purified in this darkness, it happens occasionally that this mystical and effective theology, while inflaming the will, wounds also, by enlightening the other faculty of the intellect with a certain divine light and knowledge, so sweetly and so divinely that the will, aided by it, glows in a marvellous manner, the divine fire of love burning within it with living flames, so that the soul appears to have received a living fire with a living understanding. This is what David referred to when he said, "My heart waxed hot within me, and in my meditation a fire shall burn," so vehemently that I thought it to be already on fire. This kindling of love, in the union of these two faculties, the intellect and the will, is to the soul a great treasury of delight, because it is certain that the foundations of the perfection of the union of love, for which the soul hoped, are laid in that obscurity. But the soul does not reach this sublime sense and love of God without passing through many tribulations, and accomplishing a great part of its purgation. For other degrees of this union, lower than this, which are of ordinary occurrence, so intense a purgation is not required. End of section 27. Section 28 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 13. Other Sweet Effects of the Dark Night of Contemplation. This fire of love throws some light upon the sweet effects wrought in the soul by the obscure night of contemplation. For occasionally, amid the obscurity, the soul receives light. Light shineth in darkness, the mystical influence flowing directly into the intellect, and the will in some measure partaking of it, with a calmness and pureness so exquisite and so delicious to the soul as to be utterly indescribable. Now God is felt to be present in one way, and again in another. Sometimes, too, it wounds the will at the same time, and enkindles love deeply, tenderly, and strongly. For, as I have said, the more the intellect is purified, the more perfectly and exquisitely, at times, are the intellect and the will united. But before the soul attains to this state, it is more common for the touch of the fire of love to be felt in the will than for the touch of the perfect intelligence to be felt in the intellect. This burning and thirst of love, inasmuch as it now proceeds from the Holy Ghost, is very different from that of which I spoke in the night of sense. For though the senses also have their part in this, because they share in the afflictions of the spirit, yet the root and living force of the thirst of love are felt in the higher portion of the soul, that is, in the spirit, conscious of what the soul feels, and of absence of what it desires. Still, all the pains of sense, though incomparably greater than those of the sensitive night, are as nothing, because of the interior conviction that one great good is wanting, for which there is no compensation possible. Observe here that, although this burning of love is not felt in the beginning of the spiritual night, because the fire of love has not yet done its work, God communicates to the soul, instead of it, so great an appreciative love of Himself that its greatest trials and deepest afflictions in this night are involved in the thought which harasses it, namely, that it has lost God, and that He has abandoned it. It may, therefore, be said that from the first beginning of this night the soul is full of anxiety, arising at one time from the appreciation of God, at another from the burning fire of love, and the greatest of its sufferings is this doubt. For if it could be persuaded that all is not lost, and that the trials it undergoes are, as in truth they are, for its greater good, and that God is not offended, it would make no account whatever of its afflictions, but rather rejoice in them, knowing that it is serving God. For the appreciation with which it regards God is so great, though in darkness and unconsciously, that not only would it endure its trials joyfully, but also die 1,000 times to please Him. But when the fire of love and the appreciation of God together have seized the soul, it then gains such strength and energy and such eager longing after God, the effect of this glowing love, that it boldly disregards all considerations and sets everything aside in the inebriating force of love, and without reflecting on its acts, it conducts itself strangely and extravagantly, that it may meet him whom it loveth. This is the reason why Mary Magdalene, though noble herself, needed not the guests, high and low, who were feasting in the house of the Pharisee. She considered not that her presence was inopportune, and that tears were unseemly at the feast, provided she could, without delay or waiting for another occasion, reach him for whom her soul was wounded and on fire. This is that inebriating force and daring of love, which, when she knew that her love was in the sepulchre, guarded by soldiers, and a stone rolled over it and sealed, allowed none of these things to move her, for she went thither before dawn with the ointments to anoint her beloved. And finally it was under the inebriating influence of love that she asked himself, whom she took for the gardener, and who, she thought, had robbed the sepulchre where he had laid the body of her Lord. If thou hast carried him away, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away. She did not reflect upon the imprudence of her words, for it is clear that if the gardener had stolen the body, he would not have admitted the fact, and the less so, because she intended to take it away herself. This conduct of Mary Magdalene proceeded from the vehemence and energy of her love. For love thinks all things possible, and that all men have interests identical with its own. It cannot believe that there is anything to occupy men, or anything to be sought for by them, except that which occupies itself, and which itself is seeking, for it considers that there can be no occupation or desire beyond its own. Thus when the bride went out into the streets and broadways of Jerusalem, seeking for her beloved, she, believing that all were employed like her in searching for him, adjured them, if they found him, to tell him that she languished with love. So strong was Mary's love that she intended, if the gardener had told her where he had hidden her Lord, to take him away, in spite of the prohibition. Of this kind are those anxieties of love which the soul feels when it has made some progress in the spiritual purgation. The soul rises by night in the purifying darkness, in the affections of the will. As a lioness or a bear, robbed of its whelps, whom it cannot find, seeks them anxiously and earnestly, so does the wounded soul seek after God. Being in darkness, it feels his absence and is dying of love. This is that impatient love, which no man can endure long without obtaining his wishes or dying. It is like that of Rachel, when she said, "Give me children, otherwise I shall die." We have now to consider how it is that the soul, conscious of its own misery and unworthiness before God, can be so bold, amid the purifying darkness, as to aspire after union with him. The reason is that love gives its strength to love in earnest, it being the nature of love to seek for union, equality, and assimilation with the object beloved, so as to attain to the perfection of itself. And as the soul has not yet attained to the perfection of love, because it has not attained to union with God, the hunger and thirst for that which it has not, namely union, and the strength which love communicates to the impassioned will, render it bold and daring in its wishes, though the intellect, because it is in darkness, tells at the same time that it is an unworthy and miserable object. I am not disposed here to admit an explanation of the fact why it is that the divine light, being always light, does not illuminate the soul the moment it surrounds it, as it does at a later time, instead of bringing with it darkness and troubles. This question has been already partially answered, and I now answer it more fully. The darkness and misery of which the soul is conscious proceed not from the divine light which shines around it, but are in the soul itself, and it is the light which enables it to see them. When the divine light shines in upon the soul sees nothing at first but what is immediately before it, or rather what is within it, its own darkness and misery. Now, by the mercy of God, it sees what it saw not before, because the supernatural light had not shone round about it. This is the reason why, in the beginning, the soul is conscious of nothing but its own darkness and misery. But when it has been purified by the knowledge and perception of them, it will have eyes to discern the blessings of the divine light. And when its darkness and imperfections shall have been removed, it will then behold the great benefits and blessings of this happy night. This explains how great is the mercy of God to the soul, when He thus purifies it with this strong lie and bitter purgation, as to its sensitive and spiritual parts, from all affections and imperfect habits in all temporal, natural, sensitive, and spiritual respects. By obscuring its interior faculties and emptying them of all objects, by correcting and drying up all its sensitive and spiritual affections, by weakening and wasting the natural forces, which the soul could never have done of itself, by causing it to die, as it were, to all that is not God, that, being wholly denuded and stripped of its former clothing, it may clothe itself anew in God. Thus the soul's youth shall be renewed like the eagle's, clothed with the new man, which according to God is created in justice. Now this is nothing else but the supernatural light shining on the intellect, so that the human intellect becomes one with the divine. In the same way, divine love so inflames the will that it becomes nothing less than divine, loving in a divine way, united and made one with the divine will and divine love. The memory also is affected in like manner. All the desires and affections too are changed, divinely according to God. Thus the soul will be of heaven, heavenly, divine, rather than human. All this, as is clear from what I have said, is the work of God, who affects it, during this night of the soul, enlightening it and setting it on fire in a divine way, with an anxious solicitude for God alone, and for naught besides. It is with great propriety and justice that the soul repeats the third line of the stanza, which, together with those that follow, I repeat again and explain in the following chapter. End of section 28.